Hey, what's up? It's Soup here, and the first thing I want to do is welcome everyone that's given 915 a try. The goal of this video is to take what I've learned playing Kyrian Arcane Mage this tier and give you a summary of what I think you need to know to give it a try now that we can freely covenant swap. I will be glossing over a few things, but if you'd like a more in-depth video on Kyrian Arcane Mage concepts, you can find a link to my comprehensive guide in the upper right and in the description as well. All right, let's get going. Alright, let's start with the legendary. Kyrian Arcane Mage uses the Arcane Harmony legendary on gloves with crit and mastery. This legendary causes each tick of arcane missiles to buff your next arcane barrage by 8%, stacking up to 18 times. Baseline arcane missiles will give you 5 stacks, and clear casting missiles will give you 8. You'll hear me refer to these stacks as barrage stacks, and you'll see how this plays out in the single target rotation commentary coming up. Next, I want to go over Radiant Spark. It applies a debuff that buffs your direct damage spells by 10%, stacking 4 times. The tooltip is a little ambiguous because your first direct damage cast after Spark gets a 0% damage buff, so your 5th direct damage spell gets the 40% buff. Kyrian Arcane uses the fact that Barrage snapshots its damage when casted, so we're able to use the 40% Spark buff for both an Arcane Blast and a Massive Barrage. You'll hear me refer to this as snapshotting the 40% Spark buff, and you'll see how that plays out in a bit. Something important to note is that your spell queue window can affect whether this snapshotting works or not, so I've included a resource in the description to help you figure out what your spell queue window is and make adjustments if needed. Another important aspect is how Barrage cleaves. Barrage travels to the center of enemy hitboxes, which means that the range for Barrage to cleave is determined from the center and not the edge of the hitbox. This primarily causes problems on bosses with large hitboxes and during movement on trash packs and keys. I suggest getting a feel for how Barrage cleaves so you can wait for mobs to group up more before casting Barrage if needed, because Barrage cleave is what leads to the massive damage from this build. Next is talent. The talent that defines this build is Resonance, because it increases barrage damage by 15% per target hit. It's also important to understand how Arcane Orb works. It generates 1 arcane charge when casted and 1 charge every time it deals damage. The 2 talent rows that you might swap around are Shimmer versus Slipstream and Ring of Frost versus Chrono Shift. I much prefer Slipstream over Shimmer personally, but that comes down to preference entirely. All right, on to soulbinds. Here you can see all 3 of the soulbind trees as well as the conduits used in each. The criteria I use for choosing my soulbind is mainly if I can use arcane power on cooldown, because Clea only uses Magi's Brand and Ire of the Ascended potency conduits, putting arcane power on a static 2-minute timer. In general, you want to use either Pelagos or Mechanicos for single target and tyrannical keys, and then I personally prefer using Clea for fortified keys and fights where I can't use arcane power on cooldown, or there's value in lining it up with ad spawns. The main traits from Mechanicos are Brawn, the Soul Glow Spectrometer, and Effusive Anima Accelerator. I'm not personally a fan of Mechanicos because of the possibility of Brawn's knockback spreading a pack out and messing with Barrage Cleave. You can find a more detailed explanation of Pelagos and Clea soulbind traits in my comprehensive guide in the description. Next, I want to give you a rundown on the defensive toolkit. Mirror Images is extremely useful for preventing any threat during arcane power. Just be ready, because all the threat you avoided during images transfers to you immediately when they despawn. Prismatic Barrier is absolutely busted. Use it as often as you can. A more advanced concept is to save it for large magic damage hits, because it will reduce the entire hit by 20%, even if the hit is larger than the absorb shield. And lastly, Greater Invis, which is probably my favorite part of playing Arcane. It's a 60% damage reduction, a 20-second invis, and casts instantly, so it's also a feign death on a 2-minute timer. Last thing I want to go over before we get into rotations is stats. I've been following my stat weight sims from Raidbots all tier, and it's worked out well. The stats that will most impact your gameplay are Mastery and Haste. I suggest having at least 28% Mastery to avoid having frequent mana issues in single target, and for Haste, the suggested amount is 10%, but I personally hate playing with less than 12%, and I prefer to play with 13 to 14% ideally. The reason for this is because Barrage has travel time. In this clip, I'm at 24.3% Haste, and I'm standing about 35 yards from my target, and you can see that the Barrage lands just before Magi ends and therefore contributes to Magi's total damage. In this next clip, I'm at 13.2% Haste, which is how much I usually play with, and as you can see, standing in the same spot, the Barrage doesn't even come close to landing during Magi. Your Haste will dictate the range you can play in, so I suggest testing various levels and seeing what works for you. I think the best thing to do is to find the amount of haste you like, then sim yourself and follow the stat weights, but ignore the haste value and just try to keep your haste consistent where you like it. All right, getting into the single target rotation. You always want to fish for a clear casting proc pre-pull if you have less than 18 barrage stacks. I precast rune at 2 seconds, then lust, and begin building barrage stacks by casting missiles. When I hit 18 stacks, I cast Soul Lighting Ruby, which by the way, I strongly recommend for Kyrian Arcane over IQD or Imperial Ordnance, and begin the Arcane Power Ramp. The opener for the Arcane Power Ramp in both single target and AoE is precast Ruby if you have it, then Radiant Spark, Touch of the Magi, and Arcane Power plus Racials. You then cast 5 Arcane Blasts and mash the out of Arcane Barrage during the 5th blast, because that's what causes both the 5th Arcane Blast and Barrage to get the 40% spark buff. After I send that Barrage out, I cast Orb to generate 2 charges, and then cast Missiles to build Barrage stacks right up until the Rune of Power buff ends, then I send the 2 charge Barrage. My thought process behind this is that Arcane Missiles does better damage than the Arcane Blasts would, and each Arcane charge gives you less than the 40% damage buff that you get from Rune. So it seems like a more efficient use of globals to me to just buff the 2 charge Barrage. I then cast Missiles until the end of Arcane Power and start building another Barrage. I cast Barrage with only 15 stacks here because my intellect potion was about to run out. I then build as big a barrage as I can until 12 seconds before Magi. As you can see here, 12 seconds is just enough time to build 18 stacks without clear casting procs and still allow you to cast Magi the same global that it's ready. I'm now rolling into the first mini ramp. The term mini ramp refers to Magi use outside of Arcane Power. The opener for a mini ramp in both single target and AoE is Rune of Power, then Radiant Spark, and Touch of the Magi. This is pretty much the cadence of how this build works on single target. Magi ramps followed by building as many 18 stack 4 charge barrages as you can while making sure you're prepped for the next Magi without holding the cooldown. All right, moving on to the AoE rotation. You can see in this clip an example of what most transitions between trash packs look like. I build barrage stacks as the previous trash pack dies, then blink towards the next pull, precast mirror images to avoid any threat, and choose my Magi target to cast Ruby on and finish running in for the AoE Arcane Power ramp. If there isn't a specific priority target in the pack for Magi, then you'll want to pick a high health mob that melees, because casters often get separated from trash packs if kicks aren't done properly. When I get into melee range, I start the Arcane Power opener of Spark, Magi, Arcane Power. I cast Arcane Explosion twice, then Barrage, then Arcane Orb, then Arcane Blast Barrage to snapshot the 40% spark buff. I call this rotation the AoE ramp. After Magi, I try to fit one more barrage in before Arcane Power ends. At this point, I follow the AoE priority of using Arcane Explosion to build 4 charges and only casting missiles with clear casting procs until it's time to prep 12 seconds before Magi comes up. I cast missiles without clear casting here because Arcane Orb was almost up, and since it gives me 4 charges on 3+ targets, I like to build barrage stacks until Orb is ready if it will come up before I can build and cast a 4 charge barrage. You want to use the AoE ramp that I use during Arcane Power on 4+ targets during cooldowns, and follow the AoE priority rotation at 3+ targets outside of cooldowns. And at 7+ targets, just ignore missiles altogether and use Arcane Explosion to build 4 charges, then cast Barrage. At 12 seconds left on Magi, I dump the Barrage I have and prep for Magi, and then use the AoE ramp for the mini burn. For most situations, you will probably get 1 use of cooldowns out on a trash pack, then build barrages until the pack is almost dead, then pull 18 stacks for the next pull. Next up, I want to show an alternate AoE rotation and a couple alternate cooldown pairings that I use when I have Magi planned for something coming up sooner than 45 seconds. This alternate AoE ramp is a hybrid between AoE and single target, and is useful in situations where the Magi target has lower health, such as tyrannical trash mobs, or if you're trying to more evenly AoE on a 3 pull. After the opener, you cast 2 Arcane Blasts, Barrage, Arcane Orb, and then Blast Barrage to snapshot the 40% spark. This next rotation is pairing Rune of Power and Radiant Spark together, and is mainly useful when running Clea or Mechanicos because of how Spark puts combat meditation on cooldown with Pelagos. The situation I use this in is if I'm using Arcane Power and Magi on the next pull that's at least 30 seconds away and I want to help finish off the current trash pack. If you start with 0 charges, you cast Rune, Spark, Orb, Arcane Explosion 3 times, then Blast and Barrage to snapshot the 40% spark buff. Alternatively, if you start with at least 2 charges, you can cast Rune, Spark, Arcane Explosion twice, Barrage, Orb, then Blast and Barrage to snapshot the 40% spark buff. You can also use these rotations with spark by itself, which works well. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the comments, or please feel free to join my Discord and ask there. If you enjoyed this video, or you learned something, or you think this guide could help someone else out there, then the best way you can show your support for free is to like and subscribe. Kyrian Arcane Mage does take some getting used to, but I promise it is some of the most fun I've had playing Mage. Also, let me know in the comments if you like the format and you'd like to see similar guides for other specs. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.